Hi everybody, thank you very much for coming. We're extremely happy to be able to introduce Tatiana Smoliarova of Columbia University. Tanya is the author of Lyrics Made Visible, Derzhavin, which came out in Russian in 2011. And the English translation and reworking of the book will come out in 2016 from Academic Studies Press, and that will be just in time for Derzhavin's Jubilee, as we say in Russian, Jubilee. And Tanya works on Russian and French poetry and the Enlightenment and its legacies, and we're very glad to have someone talk to us about the 18th century because we don't have to hear much about it, so thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Anne, and thank you for coming, because I know all too well what is this last days of April and first days of May when nobody is for anything, and especially for Derzhavin. Anne mentioned the Jubilee. It would not be, well, exactly. Probably the word Jubilee can still be used, so 2016 would mark 200 years from since Derzhavin's death in 1816, and just asked me when we were talking before came here whether Derzhavin is now a big figure in Russia, whether he's being discussed. It seems to me that so, but not yet. But I think it's very interesting what they will make of him in 2016, because really our authorities and in the Ministry of Culture, they really know how to use various figures in their own goals. And I think that Derzhavin would, as much as I love him, to some extent would be a rather easy figure to use in patriotic and conservative and even at some point, I didn't want to use nationalistic, but patriotic vein. But we'll see. It's interesting to see what will happen. It's interesting that 100 years ago, almost 100 years ago, in 1916, right, it was the second or the third already year of the First World War I, and there were many actually articles and writings about Derzhavin, and some of them, and it's interesting that they went sort of both directions in modernist and archaic ways. So we'll see what will happen, and I think it's an interesting subject to discuss maybe after the actual. I'm bad for photos and.
Destroyed.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Just a little also stressed for various reasons. So. Derzhavin was not a nickname for the poet who was born in 1743 for the family of Roman Derzhavin, and so it was the actual name, the actual last name. But although I've been working on Derzhavin now for years, I must admit that I rarely, if ever, thought of this stately component of his last name, because of course Derzhava is the very symbol of the empire, of the state, as the ball with a cross that would be represented in most of allegorical and imperial portraits. And there was one of his predecessors, ancestors. Yes, sorry. Words, ancestors whose surname was Derzhava, but that was on his Tatar actually side. It was not until I had to put these two words, Derzhavin and Freedom, next to each other to juxtapose them, that I thought that it sounds almost like an opposition, Derzhavin and Freedom, Derzhavin versus Freedom. And here I must, fortunately we're in this very informal circle, and I'm happy to see various dear faces. So I can confess that when my dear colleague Anne suggested that I could ask whether I would like to come and talk to you at the end of the school year, I said that it will be a great honor, which it is, but I said that the problem was that I had to be just 2 days earlier, Monday, in St. Petersburg giving a lecture in European University, and so it will be, I never give one and the same talk twice, but it would be a big problem to work on something else. And I said that they, in a strange way, imposed the topic on me. So there is a so it's European University, which is one of relatively few, institutions of higher education with a clear European westernized program, and they still. That European university several years ago had great problems, and I think that many of us actually signed a petition for it not to be destroyed, and it fortunately survived. So they have various scholarly centers within the European University, and one is the Center for Republicanism, for Republicanist Studies. And so when Oleg Karkhordin, who is the rector of the university, at some point asked me whether I could talk about Derzhavin for this Republican seminar, and I also said that with pleasure, but Derzhavin was not a Republicanist. If anything, he was not a Republicanist. He said, okay, then could you talk about Derzhavin and Freedom? Derzhavin and Freedom, it's a puzzling topic or approach, but as it happens, sometimes the topic that seems most weird provides you with a new perspective and lets you read even the text that you think you've read before in a slightly different way. So that's what I would share with you, although of course it's with slightly different angle. Well, it's strange why the next slide that it shows to me is not what I. Okay, I will change the order. That's fine. I, for some reason, have a different printout. So it's really not an accident that Derzhavins Face, just a piece of Derzhavins Face, this famous portrait by Vladimir Borovikovsky of 1795, that it appears on the front cover of Richard Wortman's seminal study of the development of Russian legal consciousness. So he chooses the face of Derzhavin to be just the face of Russian legal consciousness. And it's interesting that the Russian version of the book that was translated by Mikhail Dolbilov, whom many of us know, does not have this portrait because, well, NLO just has a different design of cover, but instead it has, it's called Vlastители Судьи, so rulers and judges, thus paraphrasing one of the most famous odes by Derzhavin to rulers and judges that was written in 1780, and then had several versions. Derzhavin, the first Russian minister of justice, of course, in this new system of ministries, to whom Wortman dedicates a whole chapter in the book, is an important figure in the history of Russian legal consciousness, and to the same extent, legal consciousness was an important part of Derzhavin's figure in mind. So he really thought that his mission was to make people observe and respect the laws. It was the first thing for him and his state mission as he understood it. Unlike Pushkin in his Жестокий век, in the cruel age, Derzhavin never celebrated freedom, right? I'm referring to Pushkin's most famous lines from his version of Exegi Monument, from Horatian Monument, что в мой жестокий век прославил я свободу. So Derzhavin never claimed to celebrate freedom, never celebrated freedom, and in the same fourth stanza, penultimate stanza in his version of the monument, he claimed, he said that he should be given credit for daring sing in playful Russian lyrics, петь в забавном русском слоге, or in Peter Francis' translation, in sprightly verse, praising Filitsa, Catherine the Great, lauding God with open heart, and the truth in face of kings with candid smile to plead. So the last, really strange order of slides. So yes, that's the most famous lines from Rulers and Judges. Цари, я мнил, вы боги властны, никто над вами не судья, но вы, как я, подобны страстны, и так же смертны, как и я, и вы, подобно так падете, как с древ увядший лист падет, и вы, подобно так умрете, как ваш последний раб умрет. These are just the almost, canonical lines from to rulers and judges, and there is no doubt a great deal of freedom of expression, freedom of speech in this very free transposition of Psalm 82nd, 82. And this poem did have a considerable history of being forbidden by censors, so the first draft dating, so I put this question mark because it's not quite clear what was the first and the second draft, 1780. It was not fully printed until 1808, which was the last collection of Derzhavin's poetry in his lifetime. And in the first major edition of Derzhavin's works, published in 1798, the censors disallowed the inclusion of the ode due to, suspicions that it might incite Jacobin sympathies. And yet, needless to say, Derzhavin had no Jacobin sympathies, and on the contrary, often used this expression to blame his enemies. And his...
1780 Jacobin?
No, it was 98. So it was the first, of course not. It would be interesting. Yes, so no, it was, I say, the first major edition of Derzhavin's works of 1798, and so they were afraid of this Jacobin sympathies, but I say that Derzhavin used this word himself and didn't have any Jacobin sympathies. So Wortman, in his book, he juxtaposes Derzhavin and Radishchev. He writes almost like Plutarch, this parallel lives. So he juxtaposes Derzhavin and Radishchev, a radical thinker. If someone was a real Russian radical republicanist, of course, that was Radishchev, who tried to struggle with the system, which he thought essentially evil and corrupt, and when he realized it was impossible to destroy it, he committed a suicide, thus following the Cato pattern path. And Derzhavin, who thought that the system that, among other things, let him raise in the way he did, was ultimately all right, but should be just, but the laws should be observed. So 10 days after Radishchev committed suicide, Derzhavin became a minister of justice and remained in this position for a short yet magically measured term. He was a minister of justice for 1 year, 1 month, and 1 day. It really sounds like a fairy tale, but it was life, as many things were in Derzhavin. So he was the general procureur from September 7th, 1802 through October 8th, 1803. So Derzhavin was deeply against constitution, while Alexander I, for instance, 1805, so it was already after Derzhavin retired, was in correspondence with Thomas Jefferson about constitution. And Derzhavin was against any form of abolition of the serfs. And which of course shouldn't forget that Derzhavin distinguished himself during the campaign against Pugachev. So one who distinguished himself in this campaign would barely be for various freedoms. So, so speaking of abolition, even the first steps towards abolition of the serfs, it was precisely his active opposition to the project of the ukaz, the law of the free agriculturals. Otherwise, I never know, Jean, how free agriculture, free grain cultivators, there are different translations. Anyway, the law that was very dear to Alexander I's heart in the early years of his reign, which would let landowners, which would let the peasants buy themselves off from the landowners and then pay them with their works. But anyway, that was, of course, that should be done. The owners should be willing to do so, and yet, Derzhavin was against it and dedicates many pages of his notes, of his very interesting documentary biography that he presents as an almost official document, this story of this law. But to make the long story short, it led to the loss of his post as a minister of justice. So among other things, he said to the emperor, "It is dangerous to rule about freedom before an uneducated rebel." It's a somewhat shortened translation. In Russian, it was «Растверживать о мнимой вольности и свободе простому, еще довольно непросвещенному народу опасно». And of course, this is a typical argument of the conservative people, still very much used nowadays, or nowadays it's maybe no longer needed, but several years ago it was still explaining why Russia always needs this strong power. So the unenlightened people should not be given freedom, and they won't know what to do with it. Derzhavin wrote in his notes that these catastrophic ideas have been incited to the emperor's mind by a certain preceptor Laach, whom he really hated, and of course Laach, coming from the very depths of Swiss republicanism, was not dear to him. And he says that the law was pushed and invented by the emperor's young friends, whom precisely he calls a Jacobinian gang. As he says, император стакнулся с якобинскую шайкой. So of course, maybe I should have translated it, but it's interesting that how this very phrase describing the poor end of the story with free agriculture is in Derzhavin's notes. It's a one-page long phrase full of inversions with, I don't know, I think 10 subordinate clauses, so which is usual, and I will talk a little bit more about it in Derzhavin's poetry also. The more he is ferocious, the more he is enraged, the more complicated and unreadable would be his phrases, for instance in his anti-Napoleonic poetry. But here, although it's prose, we still have to read it several times, because as if he's losing his breath. I would call it the syntax of rage. But the law was accepted without the second discussion in the Senate, on which Derzhavin insisted in March 1803, and 6 months later, in early October, as I said, Derzhavin was no longer a minister, replaced by certain Lopukhin, who was a representative of precisely this case of amenable officials Derzhavin never wanted to be, and was ferociously struggling with. And it's interesting that in his notes, that is a rather thick volume, it's basically the end. So he lists 15 cases when he was serving particularly eagerly, zealously, and was supposed to be praised, and yet was punished. And then, so between 1803, when he had to retire, and 1811, when the notes were written, there were 8 years. These 8 years are covered in 2 pages of the book. So really, Derzhavin, at least that was his claim, thought that after the end of his career, it was not much there was not much to talk about. Henceforth, he was a retired poet. The next day, he wrote the poem you have in front of you. That's the only poem in Derzhavin's oeuvre that is called Freedom, Svoboda. So unfortunately, unlike many Derzhavin texts that have English translations, for instance, in the wonderful edition prepared by Alexander Levitsky, this poem is not translated, so I just made a word-for-word translation, but I hope it helps. And actually, and again, I will talk about it. It's a relatively. I can give you another one. So it's actually, let me go. Yes, I just wanted to show you that not only it's the only text that is called Freedom in his works, but it's actually a very curious edition of Derzhavin that appeared in mid-19th century, I think around 45, prepared by Nicolas Lev. And just a curious case of addition. He reorganized everything. It's not chronological. It's thematical, but in a different way than Derzhavin himself. So, for instance, Derzhavin calls this, or lists this poem under anacreontic songs, and Palladio moves it to anthological poems. But he also, after the preface, he provides a chronological, so it's not like the contents of the volume, but he gives the years and major poems, and he follows Derzhavin's own wishes, what poems to count under every year. So you see that, of course, there were many more poems written in 1802 and 1803 and 1804, but you see that 1803 is marked as if there were just one poem written, Svoboda, freedom. So the poem you see in front of you. Yes, but the on the handout, adding the English translation, I reproduced. Derzhavin was very lucky to have probably the best of all Russian poets. I think he was the luckiest to have the best publisher ever, Yakov Grot, who prepared this incredible 8-volume edition in 1860s, 1870s, providing Derzhavin's poetry with wonderfully subtle and complete comments based partly on Derzhavin's own explanations, partly on the context, and also, although Derzhavin since 1790s was obsessed with the project of having all his works illustrated, or rather amplified by pictures. He used this formula "домолвить карандашом," so adding with a pencil something that could not be said with words. And it's a separate story of this illustrated editions that never actually fully happened until the edition of Grot. But all the illustrations that are published here, including the vignettes that you see in this poem, they were the programs for this illustrations were composed by Derzhavin himself and his friends. So I will comment on these pictures a little later because I think they are important. So the question is, what freedom does he talk about? And the first answer is quite obvious: the relief, getting rid of a job he no longer wanted, although we know how upset he was and how catastrophic actually this new function of merely being a retired poet was for him. So this is the answer that we may give right away, being aware of the circumstances in which the poem was written, as all Derzhavin readers would be, because that's the note that he would give that would be given in all his editions. But of course, we should look at the poem itself. When approaching a poem, especially a short one, I always follow the scheme of the eminent analysis of Poetics text proposed in the mid-20s by a Moscow formalist, Boris Yerkho, who was much less known than his St. Petersburg colleagues, and yet somewhat more, I don't know, oftentimes exact and scholar, but I don't want to compare them. Anyway, this scheme was developed by my own mentor, my own late mentor, Mikhail Leonovich Gasparov, who always mentioned that it was not him, but Yerkho who suggested this scheme. So the idea is quite simple, is that the composition of every poetic text has 3 levels onto which all the features of its form and contents are placed. Of course, it's slightly oversimplifying, and yet it's, so every poem has the first level, the ideas and images, with 2 sub-levels, ideas and emotions, images and motifs, very roughly nouns and verbs, basically, that we will find in the poem. The second, stylistic, which means vocabulary, and the use of tropes, so the use of words in their proper and figurative meaning, and words in their combination and placement, so syntax. And the third level is prosody, so it's just what we perceive with the ear, meter, rhythm, rhyme, the organization and stanzas. So each level of this, so to say, 3-storied building of a poem is perceived by one particular side of our consciousness. The lower sound level we perceive with an ear, right? So basically to distinguish between iambic tetrameter and to understand whether it's iambic tetrameter or, I don't know, archaic trimeter whatsoever, we do not even have to know the language, right? We just can count the syllables. So we only need a hearing faculty. The second middle level is perceived with our linguistic feeling. So to understand whether a word is used in its proper or figurative meaning and whether the word order is direct or free, possible or impossible. We all, of course, should master the language. And finally, the upper level of ideas and images can only be processed by our mind and imagination. And most interesting things, I think, in the history of poetry actually emerge when we think how these three levels coexist within the text. So I will now read the poem and we'll look at these three levels. But at some point, and actually when they proposed this weird topic, Derzhavin and Freedom, in St. Petersburg, I thought, I never know how to say hooliganство in English, although, I mean,
Hooliganism.
Well, somehow it's more strong in English than in Russian. So I thought that it might be curious with freedom, mischievous, yes, mischievous, I had a mischievous idea, of possibly applying this three-storied scheme not to a single text, but to the corpus of Derzhavin's works. I thought that it might be curious to see how freedom exists on the level of ideas and emotions, on the level of, first of all, syntax, of course, the free word order, and on the level of prosody, when, in what circumstances, free verse of various kinds would appear, and whether these three levels would, I don't know, correspond or contradict each other. Of course, it's really a little rough, but and yet I think that that's at least a way in which one can be thinking. So let me read this poem, because as one of the levels is audio, that should be read. Теплой осени дыханье, помывание дубов, тихое листов шептанье, восклицанье голосов. Мне, лежащему в долине, наводили сладкий сон. Видел я себя стоящим на высоком вдруг холму, на плоды вдали глядящим, на шумящую близ волну, и как будто в важном чине я носил на плечах холм. Дальше. Власти мне святые иго то велели несть, все венцы суля земные, титлы, золото и... yes, it's missed, but it's титлы, actually, the ranks. Золото и честь. Нет, восстав от сна глубоко, я сказал им, не хочу. Не хочу моей свободы, совесть на мечты менять, гладкие воды, коль погоды их не могут колебать. Власть тогда моя высока, коль я власти не ищу. So you have the English text. I won't read it aloud. So speaking of ideas and emotions, again, everything is very clear about this poem. Maybe not even worth, almost too obvious. Derzhavin wants to persuade himself that everything that happened to him was exactly how he wished, right? Although we know that it's psychological, absolutely normal. The central motif is, I always confuse motif and motive. I always ask my students, so motif, yes. The central motif is that of poet's sleep. He's a dreaming man. We can almost think of actually the opening of what lines of Wordsworth's Ruined Cottage, written almost in the same years, right? And talking about also the same Horatian or Virgilian topaz who on the soft cool moss extends his careless limbs beside the root of some huge oak whose aged branches make a twilight of their own, and so on and so forth. So the dreaming man, so it's of course the poem is allegorical. He uses the allegories of the hill, and actually the expression, I don't know whether the English equivalent exists, but mountain falling from the shoulders, in Russian there's this expression "garas splech." It exists already, so I checked the 18th century language dictionary. So it's like realization of this idiomatic expression. And the poet is having a dream about his own high position, the high hill, right, which turned to be, the hill turns to be on his own shoulders, as in some vertiginous, gravity-defying experience. The first two stanzas and the first 4 lines of the third one are about this dream. And then the poet wakes up to say no to the dream and to the actual offerings that he had, because when he was Alexander, the emperor, before basically firing him, he suggested that he could stay in the Senate and keep going with some of his missions. And he said, no, if I'm retiring completely. And so the last stanza is almost a slogan. He does not want to trade his freedom and consciousness for the dreams. So the last 2 lines sound like a motto of an emblem. Speaking of the emblems and images used in this poem and around it, and again, as I said, so that's, you see, it's bad quality, but it's the same picture that you have. As I said, for Derzhavin, the illustration should never be redundant or repetitive, and should add with a pencil what could not be expressed verbally, домолвить карандашом. So we should look at it as a necessary visual complement to the text, sometimes slightly alternating its meaning. So the images used for the vignettes that Derzhavin himself explains, you see right значение at the bottom, значение рисунков, эрот на берегу реки под осенним несколько поблекшим дубом, клетка, and the second клетка, из которой вылетает птичка. So the images used for the vignette, especially this one, is actually, does belong to the iconographic tradition of Melancholia. So this gesture you would find in all the iconographies from Cesare Ripa to many others. Of course, famous Dürer Melancholia is not exactly the same, but you see that the gesture of Melancholia is here. Melancholia is usually associated with autumn as the season, which here happily, so to say, coincided with the real time when Derzhavin was, had to retire. Yes, and so the oak also is a part, especially oak in the fall, is a part of this same tradition. So all the self-reassuring words and the mini plot of the dream seem to contradict the actual mood of the poet, which is melancholic. Of course, Derzhavin would easily operate the symbols and emblems. That was still the visual language that was in his mind. The second image of a bird leaving a cage corresponds to the feeling he would rather, that he said he pretends to have. On the level of language, right, there is nothing specific. As the entire poem, bless you, as the entire poem, allergies. As the entire poem is an allegory, so there are no metaphors inside it. It's easy to read, and as I said, it's much, much easier to translate even word for word than most of Derzhavin's poems. The syntax is pretty straightforward. And the first stanza is almost verbless, right? It's like, make us think of famous poem by Афанасий Фет, «Шепот, легкое дыхание, трели соловья», whispers, timid breathing, nightingale. So it's almost exclusively nouns. So everything seems pretty lucid. Stanzaic structure of the poem is rather exquisite because it seems to be 2 interwoven ribbons. You see that each stanza has this additional 2 lines, right? The 5th and the 6th, that seem first not to have rhymes. But actually, if you look closely at them, you see that they all rhyme between them, among them, forming almost a second poem or a second line. «Мне, лежащему в долине, наводили сладкий сон, и как будто в важном чине я носил на плечах холм. Нет, восстав от сна глубоко, я сказал им не хочу. Власть тогда моя высока, коль я власти не ищу». So, which creates this feeling of entire harmony and that it's totally closed, right? It's like there is no exit, that's accomplished and finished. I think that Yes, so this form is inspired by some of the fixed forms of the European tradition, like villanelle or triolet. It's also almost ideal trochaic tetrameter. All the stresses are in place. And I think it can be compared to Pushkin's winter poems of 1824 that everyone would know, Бурям блою небо кроет, so all those poems written during his exile when he spent it in Mikhailovska with his old nurse. And also this ideal trochaic tetrameter seemed to mimic the soothing sound of his old nurse's spindle. Right? So I think that actually both Pushkin's poem of the time and Derzhavin Freedom are a perfect illustration for a wonderful tiny article by Sergei Averintsev that I think should be translated in English, and especially it's just 4 pages long, which is called Rhythm как Theodicea, Rhythm as Theodicy, where Averintsev, who was, do you know this? It's a wonderful small piece of writing, and Averintsev, who you know, who was very religious himself and who was actually a priest, he wrote this small article on the how to say soothing effects of poetic rhythm, where he claims that in poetry form oftentimes serves as a counterbalance to the contents. As he says, content is a human life, a human voice, while the form is an omnipresent background for this voice. Classic form, I quote, is like the sky that Andrei Balkonsky watches on the battlefield of Austerlitz, even if it does not give him a true consolation in the sweet, almost cheesy meaning of the word. It gives some idea of the universal, and hence leads out from the dead end of the particular. Well, I hope it's clear. He gives some, he says that Pushkin's significance for the Orthodox thought was not his contemplations on Yefim Sirin, but how he puts sometimes absolutely desperate lines, so even in Evgeny Onegin, in this very regular meter and form. I think something like that can be said of this text by Derzhavin, and that made me think of another article of yet another Russian classicist by formation, Yuri Shiglov, the co-author of Lalkovsky, among other things, who had an article on one of Anna Akhmatova's poems that had a subtitle, Poetics of Anesthesia, Поэтика обезболивания. Well, of course, that's a rather general title, but I think that the poetics of this poem, written just on the next day after his retirement, can be called Poetics of Anesthesia. Another wonderful case can be found in Derzhavin's transposition of Psalm 101, the Jeremiad, where the Jeremiad is packed in the ideal iambic tetrameters. So in the following month, Derzhavin kept self-comforting and becalming, although using absolutely different antidotes. Instead of soothing his own and his reader's ear, he would break all possible rules. So he would finally, after this freedom in purely, sense of relief, he will get more and more the poetic freedom of breaking all possible rules. In the Grotz edition, freedom is followed by a poem that is called Magic Lantern, a poem on which I would say 2 words, precisely because I can talk for another 2 hours about it. And it's rather difficult to. Well, that's a vignette also in Groth's edition, representing, you see the magic lantern projecting an image on the wall. So it's a poem that consists of a frame, of a philosophical frame of 1 introductory stanza and 3 concluding stanzas, and between them there will be 8 pictures changing each other, reaching the apogee, pictures drawn from popular imagery. Well, it starts, I didn't have the English translation, but it starts, just to give an impression, гремит орган на стогне трубный, пронзает ночи тишину, очаровательный огонь чудный малюет на стене луну, в ней бродят тени разнородные, волшебник мудрый, чудотворный, жезла движением уст отец, то их творит, то истребляет, народ толпами поспешает смотреть к нему таких чудес. That's more or less how it sounds, but of course it's difficult to perceive it, although this stanza is relatively easy to perceive. Then all the, I'll get to this stanza later. So in this exchanging 8 tableaux of the magic lantern, the only compositional principle of which is that we can't absolutely predict what will come next, and this tableau cannot coexist. So he covers virtues and vices of men, 4 elements of the world, and the concluding stanza is this one. Unfortunately, for some reason, I couldn't put them in the one slide. Should I leave the Russian or the English? English? Okay, so that's so as the apogee of all possible human vices appears a figure of Napoleon, right, who is not named but guessed here, and actually he in this translation one important thing is lost. He says reaches out to claim the crown. Actually, in Russian original, he says граждан не внемлет добрых стону, простер десницу на корону, исчезнь, исчез. So actually, it's a metonymy, it's a close-up that he outstretches his, how it's called, десница. It's not just right hand, it's a poetic expression. Yeah, well, basically right hand to the crown. And this poem was written in February 1804, while the coronation of Napoleon happened several months later. And as you all know, the most famous and scandalous episode of this coronation was that instead of waiting for the Pope to put the crown on his hand, Napoleon really snatched it and put on his head. So it's one of this remarkable, almost magical, poetic, predictions of what could happen. But of course, Napoleon, why this? Napoleon is the embodiment of all the evils for Derzhavin, especially in his later years. His magic emergence, of course, connected to all these Jacobean gangs. Derzhavin, in a complex way, connected, so the rise of Napoleon with his own descent. He said that this poem, he just wrote in his explanations that this poem was also written to console, to becalm himself. And if we ask why, that's in this poem full of terrible Slavonic forms and words that wouldn't be understandable already for Derzhavin's own contemporaries, Latinizing syntax, absolutely free. The curious thing is that Derzhavin uses absolutely European, mostly French metaphor of a magic lantern of history, partly drawn from Edmund Burke, from Reflections on Revolution in France. How could he become himself? Because magic lantern, this marginal form of theater, functions in such a way that if we can't predict what will happen next, why bother, right? So, and one of these final stanzas say, is not this world a magic play wherein the lantern shadows change, enchanting and deceiving man? Well, in Russian it's better. Необывательный, волшебный, магический сей мир фонарь, где видны тени переменные, где веселяся ими царь, иль маг какой, волк непостижный, в своих намерениях обширных планет круг тайны с высоты единым перстом обращает и земнородных призывает мечтами быть и зреть мечты. So that's the freedom to relax, to behold, to close the eyes and say disappear if you wish to disappear. So all this freedom that is unavailable for a person who is inside the historical process, who cannot look at it from outside. It's actually curious to think of the neighboring of the freedom and the magic lantern in the Graz edition, because absolutely by chance I was reading Ernst Gombrich article on art and popular imagery in Romantic Age, where he talks about precisely the motif of poet's sleep and the popular imagery and anti-Napoleonic satires of the same year and how they coexist. So, but you see that already in this poem, it's absolutely not lucid. The syntax, again, is terrible. The stanzaic structure is close to figurative poetry. So here the consolation comes just from this idea, from the image of the magic lantern, from a certain pattern of changing events, of changing pictures. This is just to illustrate that in general, at the turn of the 18th and 19th century, magic lantern became one of the attributes of Father Time, and so the signs of time itself. And at some point I was lucky to find this New Year German postcard where the Father Time projects the year 1808. So we have this double projection, 1808 on the wall, while the year 1807 is destroyed here. So it's the image of time itself. But the time, as in this picture, is terribly flowing away. So I will skip certain things. So in the Magic Lantern, Derzhavin no longer uses the soothing effects of regular rhythm or streamlined syntax. And the poem is extremely hard to get through. So this poem probably was influenced already by an important linguistic event of 1803, because 1803 was really a pivotal year in Derzhavin's life, and it was marked by two completely different events. One was what I mentioned by linguistic importance, was the publication of one of the most notorious books in the history of Russian linguistics, so the Discourse on the Old and New Styles of Russian Language by Shishkov. And again, I'm almost surprised that our present-day authorities have not yet invited Shishkov to be there, to collaborate, because no, Medinsky, I don't want absolutely, I'm far from, I'm always afraid to speculate with the parallels, but that's, the use of foreign words that are completely abandoned. Some, we can again talk about this in the discussion, how foreign books for kids are being brought away from the libraries because okay, that's the topic for the discussion. So Shishkov, as you all know, was against especially French language, and he thought that it was basically intelligentsia to blame that Russian, values were no longer that strong, and maybe Derzhavin would stay away from him, which would be better for his poetry and for him as a figure. But also, it was also in 1803 that a person who sort of defined the previous years of his life died. That was Nicolas Lev, the famous architect, the zealous Russian Palladionist, the translator of, actually only first book of 4 books on architecture by Palladio were published. He was Derzhavin's close friend, relative. They were married to sisters, and he was, so to say, his personal enlightener. And actually, I think it's very hypothetical, but speaking of freedom, of course, well, that's, for instance, the famous engraving of Derzhavin's house at Zvanka, built after the project by Lvov. You see that it's a typical Palladian villa. And of course, Palladionism, the villas by Palladio himself, English Palladian villas of the early 18th century, and Russian Palladianism, unlike speaking architecture like, I don't know, Ledoux, Boulez, right? It did not contain a direct message. With Palladianism, we can rather speak of horizon of meanings, but of course, in this horizon of meanings, to use Lefebvre's expression, there was, if not republicanism, but the idea of light opposition, or at least, distancing oneself from power, and being free at least to think, and being free not to participate. Speaking of nowadays, I mentioned that I was in St. Petersburg, but before that I was for entire 2 days in Moscow, and I ran to the exhibition that just opened, and is and already I was impressed by how many people visited it. It's unfortunately, it's so new that I couldn't find on the internet the actual poster. So that's the poster of this exhibition when it was last year in Italy, but actually now it's called Palladio в России, Russia Palladiana, so it's exactly the same album and the same picture of it. And it's interesting how this actually, again, we can talk more about it during the discussion, but this exhibition is divided between Tsaritsina and the Museum of Architecture in the center of Moscow, because Palladianism in Russian 18th century was associated with freedom, while Palladianism in 1930s became an integral part of what Paperny called culture too, so something very stable, very sort of non-freedom. And it's interesting at what point which associations actually work. But of course so I even managed to visit both, and I say that it was just the first days, and it was absolutely full of people. So I think, well, these are just some pictures of Villa Rotundas and the famous portrait by Borovikovsky of Derzhavin's wife, pointing, as in all these portraits like Potemkin and Catherine, they would always point at the most important thing, right? And the landscape, so she's pointing at this villa. And if we compare the famous Chiswick House, so the most exemplary British Palladian building, and Derzhavin's house at Zvanka, it looks like, you know, kids' pictures, find 10 I would say differences among them. So I say it's very hypothetical, but Lvov was no longer there. But I think that the very fact of living in a place loaded with this association and with these ideas maybe didn't let Derzhavin get entirely in this conservative way. But of course, one should be very careful with this, with such assumptions. So Lvov was no longer there, and after 1803, Derzhavin started getting closer and closer to Shishkov and his surroundings, and finally that was known as Беседа любителей российского слова, which was very conservative, very nationalistic, very patriotic circles. And as it's after this year that Derzhavin stops being that respectful towards the prosodic canon that he didn't dare, upon which he didn't dare infringe till a certain point. So, of course, he always used some rhythmic and phonetic liberties, but it was after 1803 that he started his quasi-cacophonous instrumentations, free yams, and as it was put by Khodasevich in his marvelous biography of Derzhavin, everything against which, I quote, everything against which poets struggled during Derzhavin's lifetime and after him, and to which poets would ultimately turn a century or more later. Include, of course, when Khodasevich wrote it, he probably meant first and foremost himself. So very briefly, actually, about, as I said, it's only the idea to trace the three levels in Derzhavin's corpus. Of course, here, so it's more like a project for the future. One of the most interesting things would be the question of inversion and free word order, because that was probably the linguistic question that was most closely associated with ideology. In France of the 18th century, where there was the team of Cartesian thinkers who saw that only straight word order was possible, and that was the strength of French language, and then philosophers like Condillac, Diderot, Mercier, Delille, and some others, Batu, who thought that it was the weakness of French language that it couldn't have inversions. Mercier said, nous accumulons les choses, we bring the words together, we chain them one to another, we do not construct them, we only accumulate them. We wouldn't know how to put them in such a way that they would mutually support each other. Circular and oblique movements are also forbidden for us. We can only follow the straight line. It's a wonderful quote, and Mercier promised to write a treatise on inversions, which he never did. But so for them, the lack of inversion in French language was the lack of third dimension. so to say. And of course, that was happily supported by Shishkov, who said, they say themselves that French language is so poor and ours so rich. It's also an interesting counterpoint. So they basically thought that the lack of inversions also deprives French of performative dimension. We could go through various uses of Derzhavin of inversions. I would mention that he precisely uses it to stage certain things. He uses it to show, for instance, his machines in his zvanka, in his manor, in his estate. And there he used inversion to show actually the very action of the machine. Then I would skip the Tselenie Saula. And an interesting case, for which we don't have time, is his translation of Récit de Théramène from Racine, where Derzhavin uses the frame. So the words that precedes the words of the dying Hippolyte are in direct word order, and then to render how the dying person tries to say as much as possible before dying would be all of in inversions. So if you try to look at this Russian phrases, none is straight word order. They're all inverted. So Derzhavin is actually masters this wonderfully, and yet it's already 1811, and this translation will be published in the periodical of Besieda. So it's both patriotic and yet virtuous in poetic sense, and that's how he functioned, right? That's this very interesting oscillation between his conservative political ideas and very almost modernist poetics. Yes, skipping other things. On the free verse, it's actually, of course, the relationship between freedom and free verse is a very interesting question. There are various discussions of free verse. Recent discussion actually was inspired by Mikhail Grono's book Cognitive Poetics and Cultural Memory, the main message of which was basically that free verse exists in free society where we do not need to memorize things. And so he was answering the question why vers libre flourished in America and Europe in the 20th century while not flourishing in Russia. And the response was that in Russia, people always had to memorize, and as they had to memorize, they had to write in rhymes. So I'm, of course, oversimplifying, but there was this kind of correlation between the two. But that's just one possible approach. Derzhavin never had an entire vers libre. He never sacrificed both rhyme and rhythm, but he would happily sacrifice something. Again, with not having any time to that, I will just show you because it's so modern and contemporary. It can be read from the first channel of the TV, and actually, yes, last year it was exactly how many years? 2030 years since the acquisition of Crimea, and especially how they exclaim «Который Бог, который ангел, который человека вдруг бескровным уверчал нас лавром, без брани вам трофеи дал и торжество». And then we can put, whatever you want, right? Here he says «Екатерина, та венценосна добродетель, то воплощенно божество, которое дождит блаженства». Они вещали так любезным, повеся громы на стене. It's absolutely, but here, of course, his use of unrhymed. It's not it's because in Russian, vers libre has more subtle varieties between вольный стих and свободный стих, and it's not exactly the same. That would be called вольный стих. But here he's basically imitating ancient meters, right? So he would use this free verse for that. Another case, also imitating ancient meter, but with completely different ideological message, was his ode to Lvov. But again, we'll just skip it. So, but I can get back to them. His last years would be full of all kinds of lexical and meter experiments, but once again, he would never sacrifice everything. And it's curious that in his last poem Recovery Man that is also known as Nadshetность, on transience, the river of time, which is an acrostiche, and read ruin, right? Ruin-HT. The only thing that always surprised me is not that it's an acrostiche, but that for 150 years nobody noticed it until Maurice Halley, Roman Jakobson's student at Harvard, noticed it in 1950 after Derzhavin wrote it in 1816. Ruin. Here he comes back to this soothing affects of rhythm and rhyme, and it's absolutely regular, and all the experiments are left behind, and this is also the full acceptance of fate, which is also, of course, a form of freedom. And I think I will stop here and leave just all the rest for the discussion.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. So we have time for discussion, and I'll let Tanya field questions herself.
If there are any. If there are any, because I sort of left the parallels.
I actually have a question about, I'm curious what the discussion was like when you presented this week in Petersburg.
Well, of course, still I try to, alternate it slightly, because I really feel terrified. Even if I have an ocean between the two presentations, it was funny because well, they are nice but slightly crazy people, because they, in this Center for Republican Studies, because they want to see everyone a Republicanist. Well, of course, the Republicanism is a complicated notion, right? We mainly talk about it in 17th century England and then 18th century France. Actually, speaking of republicanism and free verse, it's curious that Milton, who was a Republicanist and also was explaining why to use this blank verse in Paradise Lost, it's a different question. So when I said, for instance, that Derzhavin was against the emancipation of the serfs, they would say, but it's perfectly Republicanist. I don't know, in Machiavelli or in Tacitus, they really know a lot of text, and they say that actually thinking that slaves should not be freed because they won't know what to do with freedom, it does not mean not to be a Republicanist. And I said, okay, that's probably not. I mean, it's one of the elements, but also we can say, and it would be a terrible stretch to say that if someone is against the abolition of serfdom, it means that he is Republicanist. Then they also, of course, they were very interested in how Derzhavin thought of himself. One man who is actually a historian working on the also turn of the 19th century and Russian versions of republicanism, but I think they really use it as an umbrella term. He was asking, he quoted a text by Malesherbes about self-identification of a person as a public intellectual, and so he was asking me whether Derzhavin would think of himself as someone in the forum, and his question was long and convoluted, and I said that if I may answer you in one word, I would say no, because I really think that Derzhavin, as interested, if not obsessed, he was with the posterity, and in Non Omnis Moriar, he didn't think of himself as a poet citizen. First of all, he really thought that his main mission was his state mission, and he always noted in his explanations on his writings that I started writing this poem, but then I was busy with something I had to do for the state, so I couldn't continue. Then I went back several years later. So of course that's not entirely true. But also I think that he felt himself somewhat above, right? He felt himself in dialogue either with the god or with the ruler or with the posterity. So we can't say that he was not interested in the audience. He was, but he was interested in the interlocutor, almost as, Mandelstam describes it in his the so-called articles. So some, posterity that would come later, he would happily talk to them, but he's not that interested. He was not thinking of conveying certain ideas directly. I wanted to say, yes, that about the monuments. The curious thing that we all should, everyone would know Derzhavin's Horatian, this monument, but he created a number of these monuments. And actually, in Polyevoy's edition, he has this entire section, monuments, and he created monuments for various senses, for touch, for ears, for sight. He had a very curious optical monument written in 1808. He addressed Labzin, the famous Freemason, who was also preparing the 4 volumes edition of his writings in 1808. And he has this, precisely in this almost Slavonic words, he wrote, «В книгах, как в стеклах, возжгуся, узрят далече мой дух». I will burn up in the books as in lenses, and my spirit would be seen from afar. So, and it's a typical case for Derzhavin. It's both barely pronounceable, and yet quite modern in content, right, with optical metaphors that would be at the same time used, I don't know, by Goethe or by someone else. So, Christina.
I have a comment. I was very struck by your discussion of the poetics of anesthesia. And I very recently came into contact with this kind of cutting-edge work in neuroscience and neurology, which has to do with, there's an article that was published recently that's called Attention to Attention.
I'm looking for a pen. I don't know where I put my bag, thank you.
There's a psychologist, neurologist actually at Princeton called Les Fleming, and his work basically demonstrates that there are very different types of attention. And what you were describing in terms of, the sky versus the immediate focus.
But it wasn't Averemtsov. I don't the
Right,
image of the
right.
sky is not mine.
Yes, and also the rhythm of the poem versus the theme of the poem would be kind of a textbook illustration of 2 types of attention, which is kind of narrow objective, where the subject perceives very clearly the difference between subject and object, versus a very different kind of attention where it's called immersed, where you're much more kind of, it's diffuse immersed, where you perceive not just like yourself distinct in, as if when you work on a book, in kind of like distinction from the book, but you perceive yourself as part of the big world, and it's oftentimes in relationship to nature, for example. And what's interesting is that this whole work on attention in neuroscience is all about anesthesia. It's all about actually dealing with chronic pain. So, I was, struck by the fact that literature, I think, has been doing that for a while, has been teaching us to kind of switch different modes of attention from the particular to the universal, which is what you were describing. And it's something that science is kind of catching up with.
Thank you very much. That's a precious comment. Yes, I think that, first of all, that made me think that I also forgot to mention that it's a little strange that he says in this poem, right, for the sacred powers, right? Дальше власти мне святые, иго то велели несть. So the sacred powers, not the Tsar who is now, firing him, but the sacred powers, which is not, I must admit that when I first read this text, and there is this missed, the title, the missed letters in Tla, Titla, Zolotaya Chest, I first thought that it was Tila, and I thought that maybe, given the picture of the bird leaving the cage, it's also, the soul leaving the body, but then I realized that it was Titla, titles, right? But still, it's interesting, and again, coming back to this question of how he sort of positioned and understood himself, that would put him above, right, again, on the kind of universal level. And another comment to this, and more of today, and the soothing effect is that I think, unfortunately anyway, this academic year was in New York, not in Moscow, but I follow closely what's going on there, and there is a great of course, probably we're again speaking of relatively narrow circles, but great interest in poetry. I don't know about, poetry writing, but there is, for instance, an extremely popular series called Стихи про меня, after Petr Vail's book, the anthology of poems that he once published. So there is a there's a restaurant and club in Moscow that is called House 12, Dom 12, Narbat. And so for this entire year, there was this cycle of poetry readings called Стихи про меня, where they invited people, architects, writers, philologists, poets, to read not their own poems, but other. And they started once a month, and they wouldn't expect people to come more often than once a month. Then it was every 3 weeks. Then now it's every 2 weeks. And they gather a huge amount of people. And I actually recently talked to Masha Stepanova, who is, to my mind, one of the most interesting poets writing nowadays, and also the editor-in-chief of Kolta.ru, which is the most trustworthy web resource for culture, which used to be open space before it was closed. So Masha said that, and she participated in it also. She said, I think it's a bad. So I asked basically this question: why this heightened interest? And she said that it's probably a bad sign, because people really, when people go and buy, a book by Grisha Dashevsky of a very exquisite poetry, it means that there is a hole in the heart, and it's fine when there is the hole in the heart shouldn't be too numerous, and when hundreds of people have hole in the heart and get together, but that, and of course not this poetry will be necessarily soothing, but that's of course the search of certain rhythms. I was also thinking about it. It was more or less by accident, but I had to teach this last semester at Columbia course on poetry and poetics of the 1920s, and it's also speaking of free verse, it's very interesting to look at years, especially at year 1923, which is 23, of course, is perceived as a kind of interval. It's just, Soviet, USSR is just announced, right? It's Lenin hasn't yet died. It's clear that the past is in the past, the future is in the future. It's not by accident that Tynyanov, who was so sensitive to time, called one of his best writings on Russian poetry, Pромежуток, the interval, in 1924. And so both Mandelstam and Mayakovsky write their only vers libre in their entire poetry in 1923. Mandelstam writes the Horseshoe Finder, Mayakovsky his poem on May 1st. Moisei Ginsburg, one of the most influential architects of constructivism, publishes a book, Rhythm in Architecture, Rhythm в архитектуре. Tomaszewski writes the theory of rhythm, Tynyanov writes the theory of rhythm, and so everyone is in search of rhythm in the time of interval. Unfortunately, I don't think that what we perceive nowadays is the interval. Interval is not the worst feeling. I think the atmosphere now is somewhat worse, but people would be happy. I think that the feeling of interval was probably Medvedev's years. But anyway, again, I don't want to speculate. But the fact that people are looking for switching attention and looking at the universal, which is always poetry, with its, as Kasparov said, pamять metra, right, the memory of meter, and to forget or to counterbalance the dead end of the particular, as Averyantsov put it. I think that's one of the explanations. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you to comment on the possibility of introducing two other figures into the discussion of freedom, relationship between freedom, politics, and sort of syntax or style. And I'm thinking of Radishchev and Karamzin, right? And I'm thinking, so on the one hand, you have Radishchev, whose conception of freedom is very different from Derzhavin's, but whose syntax is similar. right? In other words, whose syntax is about free word order. So much of it seems to be. On the other hand, you have Karamzin, right, who's working in the opposite direction from Derzhavin in a certain sense in terms of ordering, right, in terms of a kind of reform of language that would be on the French model. And at the same time, he actually shares a notion of freedom with Derzhavin, it seems to me, from your account, mainly, that the notion of freedom as independence, right, as this negative freedom. And so I'm kind of wondering how one might account for, right, so there is a notion of freedom that aligns it with order, right, with nature, with reason, right, which is my sense of the way that Karamzin imagines freedom. And then there's, of course, the notion of freedom that aligns it with, right, disorder, right, which you find. So I guess this is just kind of to see if there is a constellation there, if it's possible to make sense of these possibilities that seem more or less co-present at the time. It's kind of an open question.
I think it's a wonderful question, and really what to think about. I tried, just for myself to draw and try to, put this in kind of system of, I don't know, binary oppositions, that it doesn't work. It's non-Euclidean geometry. Not all parallel lines would, be perpendicular to the third one, which makes it all the more interesting, but harder to sort of to make an outline. Karamzin, from purely, well, Karamzin and Derzhavin, of course, it's there was even a volume of 18th век of the 18th century dedicated together to Karamzin and Derzhavin in the 1960s, which is curious. 1964, I think. Called Karamzin и Derzhavin в общественно-политическом литературном движении, something like that. And I just now thought that it was 1960s, which is curious. I think there was a anthology put together, collection of essays put together by Andreas Schönle years ago. I forgot how it was called, but it was something in Lotman's legacy. And there was an article by Andrei Zorin on the interest in Karamzin in Soviet times and Lotman's works on Karamzin, and there were some interesting ideas, as always, there. So Karamzin and Derzhavin were very close in the 1790s. Karamzin was always, actually Derzhavin supported Karamzin, who was very young at that point, by submitting his poems, and he was already acclaimed to Moskovsky Journal, to the Moscow Journal, in the 1791, 1792. Karamzin participated in the preparation of this poetic works that I mentioned of 1798, where rulers and judges were not included. So it was an active collaboration. Actually, it was precisely 1803 that also marked, I always thought of it as meeting at the staircase, because Derzhavin left his position as a minister in early October 1803. 2 weeks later, Karamzin got the title of the court historian, as if they met, said hello, and then one went downstairs and another one upstairs. But Derzhavin, even when he was getting closer and closer, was Shishkov. And of course, it's obvious that Karamzin was the main target, of Shishkov. Derzhavin always defended him. But he defended, it's actually interesting, he never said a word against. There were some, in their correspondence, there were some, they argued, but he never shared this, blaming from Shishkov and his surroundings. But I think that among other things, he defended Karamzin because he was for this poetic language independence and language freedom. And speaking of free word order, for instance, so as I said already, in France there were two traditions: this Cartesian seeing natural order as direct, and another tradition seeing natural, so that basically that the order of words should represent the order of thoughts, right? Mm-hmm. So this tradition got all the way back actually to Locke and to associationism, how we say. And Karamzin as in many other cases, merged the two. So he, in this actually argument of inversion, he thought that sometimes it's necessary, but not always. I just recently read a wonderful article, well, more or less, among other things, about it by, I think, one of the most subtle French scholars, unfortunately, who died several years ago, the 18e Jean Bruyère, who was a linguist and wrote a lot about Karamzin. And I say died early, he was in his 50s. And so he, precisely, it was a very interesting work placing, because before that we knew works by Lotman and Uspensky, right? Looking at Karamzin more in the background of linguistic thought of like 17th century, like Vaugelas and others and all these Cartesian thinkers. And Bruyère said that we should rather put him in contemporary linguistic thought of the 18th century. But he showed how he actually, being very sensitive, linguistically, how he would combine this rigid and I forgot how he called this both teams. So speaking of Radishev, of course, actually the famous Ode Volnost is a very interesting case where the free, actually it's full of pyrrhic and spondaic lines. So the level of rhythm, it totally corresponds to its theme. So as ever, sometimes, right, the form and the content, to use this very anachronistic terms, would contradict and sometimes coincide. But Ode Volnost is a perfect example, as in, I don't know, Collis' Ode upon Liberty, when this thing would. But again, I think that's what we're talking about. That's what makes it this period so interesting. That yes, Derzhavin and Radishev are rightfully opposed by Wortman, and yet they would coincide in certain, linguistic things. And yet, Derzhavin and Karamzin can be also opposed. And of course, Karamzin, actually as well, I think both Derzhavin and Karamzin, in their itineraries, they moved from the pole of freedom towards the pole of, I don't know, legal consciousness, right? Because I think that in Derzhavin, what always made him so interesting to me, I think that this famous, I don't know, querelle des anciens et des modernes was inside him for his entire life. To some extent, we probably all have this quarrel inside us, but some to greater extent and some to others. So he was surrounded by this westernized people such as Lvov, Bartnyansky, and it was a very, really the circle that would remind the circle of Lord Burlington and this, English British people of 1730s. And they were also very interdisciplinary, right? There was this Derzhavinski Lvovsky Kruzhok, so it's 1780s, 1790s. There was a composer, an artist, an architect, a writer, and that's why they were so interested in this project of illustrated poetry. While when Derzhavin, towards the end of his life, was getting closer and closer with Shishkov, he stopped being interested in illustrations. He wanted to write, and he was writing numerous and piling comments on his own, right? He wrote this note on his life. He dictated the explanations on his own writings to his niece. And he tried in a curious way to turn poetry back into reality in these explanations. And so he wanted, instead of дамолвить карандашом, add with a pencil, he wanted only to sort of, build upon words with words only.
I'm glad you mentioned that querelle des anciens et des modernes, because of course the ancients, especially Latin poetry, is well known for its word order that could be inverted because
it was Latin.
Yeah, because the case endings are going to tell you what, what the good grammar is, and therefore you have a lot of freedom. In other words, there's a classicizing tendency that of inversion of word order. So I wrote about Tretyakovsky, who was laughed at for that classicizing tendency. And while I find it very interesting that you're associating free world order with freedom and the moderns, as it were, I think it makes sense to me that Derzhavin, who is very much looking towards the classical idea of retirement, and there's even a book I've been trying to remember the name of it, called, the Greek and Latin ideal of retirement. Yeah, so I'll find it for you and give
Thank
it to
you.
you. So he's very much invoking a topos that's well known, that he should Latinize his
Right,
style.
of course.
Yeah. I mean, do you want to speak about that at all? Or
Hmm?
do you want to speak about that at all?
I just agree.
Okay.
I agree. I'm grateful, and I don't think. At the same time, I don't think that it contradicts. I think that that's what is interesting about Derzhavin's later years, that he's deliberately Latinizing. You're absolutely right. He's getting back to this ancient ideal, but as he's oftentimes using, quite European metaphors and images, it gets into interesting mixture. But of course, that's the freedom on the level of ideas we're talking about is also most of all this Horatian freedom. And of course, the maybe one real chef-d'oeuvre of his later years, the Evgenia Zhizvansky, is Beotocilde, right? It's the version of the second Epidus of Horace. So here it's perfectly normal to. But it's actually interesting that even within this poem, as Horatian in general as it is, that the number of inversions, for instance, in the lines that I showed where he represents how a spinning machine works or something, just statistically, I counted them at some point, I don't remember exact percentage, but the number so there would be no single phrase in straight word order, because he tries to show the actions to stage it almost. But of course, that would be within the general tendency to Latinize. So, thank you. Yeah.
This is really interesting. I had a question about free verse in 1923. I was under the mistaken understanding that Kirill Medvedev had introduced free verse into Russian poetry. So I'm really interested in hearing 1923.
That would be a big tribute to Kirill Medvedev.
Is there a big tradition before? Before Medvedev of free verse? His poetry seemed to be such a scandal because there was so little when he first came out, because there was so little tradition of that in Russian. Is that wrong?
Well, the tradition. I'm just now blanking. Kirill Medvedev is a contemporary, right? Of course. So no, of course there is a tradition. Misha Gronis, in this book that I mentioned, he traces the tradition of Russian vers libre. There was also, of course. Vers libre was, in Soviet times, considered as something associated with European modernism, hence not totally allowed. That's why it mainly penetrated Russian poetry of the 20th century through translations. There were many translations in vers libre, and Gasparov was both practicing and theorizing, sorry. Theorizing the vers libre. For instance, he explained why he decided to translate Pindar in vers libre. Of course, Pindar would not be rhyme, but it had, he could try to find an equivalent, I don't know. And so he said that, for instance, with Pindar, that a translator should always sacrifice one of these three levels that I talked about. And for instance, to render the extremely complex imagery of Pindar's ode, one should probably sacrifice, I don't know, rhythm. And of course, rhyme wouldn't mention. And Gasparov had an entire volume of experimental translations, not only of ancient poets, but of,
there's a difference between translation theory versus Russian poetry.
Of course, it probably, first of all, there were some particular cases. There was, I forgot the title, there was Mikhail Kuzmin's poem written in 1917, actually related to freedom. I'll remember later. But I say that, of course, it's interesting that Mandelstam had really just one vers libre, which was, by the way, had the subtitle Pindaric Fragment. So for him it was also the reference to Pindaric tradition, and maybe that gave this even the idea, as part of, and even Mayakovsky, with all his experiments with everything, and with all levels of poetic building, so to say, had only one entire vers libre. Of course, the culture too, the culture of the 1930s wouldn't be inviting for vers libre, and I just don't want to pretend to know. I don't know of vers libre in this epoch, but I'm sure there were some. Of course, they would be, killed, and but I mentioned the translations, although I perfectly understand that translations and poetry are different things. But it was through the translations that vers libre started getting into Russian poetry, and I know Elena Schwartz had vers libre, who is of course older than Kirill Medvedev. Sidakova had some vers libre, although actually there was a very interesting conversation with her about free verse and the system of poetry, which was published last year in Kolta. No, I'm sure. Well, Gandlevsky, Kibirov, I think Rubinstein, they tend to write with at least either rhyme and rhythm. But the basic answer is that Kirill Medvedev is not the first person, but maybe one of the most noticeable. And so, when he started writing, it was already not the time when it would be scandalous. And actually, Sidakova, in this essay, she wrote in a very curious way how in Europe now, at some point, it became original, if not scandalous, to write something with rhythm and rhyme, and that she talked to some, I think, Italian poet who said that now, Dutch, because Sidakova said that she didn't know Dutch, but she could hear that that's something very traditional, and she asked her how she said, when I was young, I couldn't let myself write any rhymed poetry. I could only produce vers libre, but now I'm old and respected, and I can let myself actually use the soothing effects of. But of course, the story of, again, I just don't want to pretend. I do not know, I think, contemporary poetry well enough to give an entire picture, but I think that now vers libre is occupy like half of it's funny that in 2009 in Derzhavin's museum in St. Petersburg, in his house in Fontanka, there was a festival of free verse. Derzhavin would turn in his coffin or maybe applaud.
Well, thank you very much for that extremely interesting talk, and we hope you'll be back again.